Hello, this is Albert Einstein. History myths fly around at the speed of light. Especially with that new internet thing you all seem to have. Thank goodness I have a direct connection to Professor Buzzkill, a fellow deep thinker who busts myths and takes names. I'm totally stoked. There's a new episode. I was stuck on this new equation anyway. E equals mc something. Something.
Once again, it's your favorite professor here, coming to enlighten you about history by busting myths and taking names. You know, current events are happening so fast these days, and the topics change so quickly that it's difficult for a history show to do sufficient research on a topic before it's replaced by something else as the hot topic. In this media-obsessed age, we seem to have the attention span of a gnat. Drives me nuts. Well, thank goodness I've got squadrons of historians here at the Buzzkill Institute, and they do all the heavy lifting and all the heavy research to get me ready for the show. And the thing we want to talk about today is the issue of border walls in history. Why were they built? Did they work? And you know why we're talking about this right now. I don't have to sort of dance around the contemporary politics of it. The issue of a border wall between the United States and Mexico not only continues to be controversial, the popular discussion of that issue has been largely taken up with myths and misunderstandings and misstatements of fact regarding famous walls in history. The Great Wall of China kept out the Mongols, for instance, you hear. Hadrian's Wall kept the Roman Empire safe from the ancient Celts and ancient Picts, and on and on and on and on and on. I could make lame jokes that Lady Buzzkill hates about the need for a Buzzkill wall to keep out historical myths and to keep abusers and misusers of history at bay. But I won't. And I won't because the topic of great walls in history, why were they built and did they work, is not only crying out for clear answers. The historically accurate answers to these questions are very complex and provide excellent examples, in my mind, of what overly simplistic responses like, yes, they always work, that's why they were built, or no, they were built mainly for show and vainglory. That's how they hurt our public debate on the use of historical evidence, which should help us make decisions about contemporary affairs. So strap yourselves in, Buzzkillers, for a world tour of some of the most famous border walls in history. Along the way, we're going to address those questions of why they were built and whether they worked, and there are almost as many answers to those questions as there have been border walls in our history. You see, building walls to define and delineate the borders of territory is almost as old as human civilization. As students, we're often told that history begins at Sumer, the ancient Middle Eastern civilization in what's now Iraq. It's frequently referred to as the earliest known civilization to have left behind historical and archaeological evidence. That's why we say history begins there. And as far as historians and archaeologists can tell, the Sumerians were the first to build a wall that wasn't just around a city, a specific city. They did it out in the provinces. They did it to repel invasions from the Amorites, a powerful nomadic tribe, as well as other neighboring enemies. But again, the evidence tells us that the walls only kept Sumer safe for a handful of years. And when the Amorites allied with some of Sumer's other enemies, they were able to overwhelm the wall militarily. A similar sort of thing happened in ancient Greece. Built to protect the connection between inland Athens and its closest harbors at Piraeus and Phalerum, 5 kilometers away, the famous long walls of Athens of ancient history were another military necessity. As the ancient Athenian Empire became threatened by enemies in the 5th century BC, they built cross-country walls to protect their city's supply routes to these essential ports, and they worked. At least for a while. And their utility, the fact that they worked during that period, relied very heavily on the Athenian navy, which was powerful and intimidating. The navy kept Athens secure and the Athenian Empire powerful, both commercially and militarily. The long walls helped protect the city itself from land incursions, especially small-scale, quick ones that couldn't be countered immediately by the Athenian army out in the Mediterranean. The key to all this was that the long walls were a part of Athenian defense. And that defense was built on a broad base, especially, again, that famous navy. For the most part, the walls did their job, even during the wars against Sparta, Athens' great military rival. But once the Athenian navy was defeated, for instance, in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, which happened as the 5th century BC drew to a close, the walls weren't enough to protect Athens itself. The walls were destroyed by the Spartans, but then rebuilt when Athens gained back much of its power, helped by Persian allies. Super complicated. But again, the whole question of permanence is not here. The new walls only worked in conjunction with the other aspects of Athenian political and military power. When the Roman Empire expanded and eventually dominated the Eastern Mediterranean world, the Athenian long walls provided almost no protection, and the Roman general, Sulla, breached and destroyed them easily in 86 BC. Yes, that's 86 BC, more than 2,000 years ago. And the Romans, of course, did their own wall building on at least one frontier of their empire. Hadrian's Wall, built in the early decades of the 2nd century AD, ran across the 70-plus mile width of what is now the counties of Northumberland and Cumbria in northern England. The Roman Emperor Hadrian claimed that he had been divinely instructed to build a border to protect his empire, protect the Roman Empire, to protect it from the ancient Celtic tribes in the north. But here again, there were other factors at play. The Romans needed some kind of structure to help regulate trade. They also used it as a justification for Roman taxation of provinces in northern Britain. We're protecting you from the barbarians in the north by building this wall, they said to the native Britons and to new Roman settlers. So these taxes are for your protection. You know the drill. But even the impressive Hadrian's Wall, built by the mighty Romans, didn't work for very long. Within 20 years, they had to build the Antonine Wall further north along what is now roughly the border between England and Scotland. And even those two walls depended entirely on other things, especially the Roman army and the larger Roman imperial structure of trade and power, to help keep the empire, intact, if you will. The walls alone weren't able to suffer the slings and arrows of political infighting in Rome, and the increasing power and sophistication of Rome's enemies in northern Europe made them less and less effective. If all these types of complications and yes, buts seem to be a running theme in our explanations of whether border walls worked as protection, it's because that's the one consistent theme in their history. And this theme only gets stronger when we get to more modern times. Wall building gets more sophisticated, but so do military tactics and technology, and as well as political sophistication, ways to figure out how to get around these things, so to speak. And we'll explain why those things make it incorrect to point simplistically at historical walls and say they worked for the purposes of protecting populations and repelling invaders. But we'll talk more about that after this break for some puffery about how important this podcast is. Back in a minute.
This is Mary Todd Lincoln. President Lincoln is indisposed at the moment, but he asked me to remind you that Professor Buzzkill is part of Entertainment One's podcast network and is available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Please subscribe and leave him a review. Please also go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com to support him on Patreon, to subscribe to his email notifications, and to shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. Follow him on Facebook, on Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and on Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. Thanks for listening.
Okay, we're back. Before the break, I was talking about how these ancient walls didn't provide permanent protection and how, at best, they only held out as long as the civilizations they protected maintained their power in other ways. But, Professor, I hear you saying, what about the biggest, the longest, most powerful wall in human history, the Great Wall of China? Didn't that keep out the invading Mongol hordes and help make China the most advanced civilization in the world in its heyday? Well, seasoned buzzkillers out there are going to recognize that what I'm about to say is perhaps our most frequent answer to historical questions. It's like we own stock in it. But as we always say, it's complicated. And the very complications in the history of and the justification for the Great Wall of China are exactly the kinds of answers we keep using to show that history can rarely be understood as giving one simple answer. Like most other ancient walls, the Great Wall of China wasn't built all at once, but started to take form when the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, began to connect existing older walls. And for several centuries, wall construction wasn't constant, but took place whenever there seemed to be threats from northern raiding groups. The Ming Dynasty built the most expensive and extensive, militaristic, and well-guarded walls from the 1300s to the 1600s AD. And for the most part, it's those preserved Ming walls that are the best known. They look like heavily fortified barriers. They run for thousands of miles, and of course, have been the most visited and photographed walls by certainly modern tourists. But despite being so formidable, they were not perfect. The Mongols overcame them in 1500 and attacked Beijing, the imperial Chinese capital, and the walls were not strong enough to keep out the Manchu Qing, who toppled the Ming Dynasty in the mid-17th century. For the vast majority of its history, the Great Wall of China served to protect against small-scale raids by nomadic groups, but it couldn't stand up to serious military attack. And remember, even these large-scale military attacks, at this time anyway, didn't use anything like modern artillery to create breaches in the wall. The wall was simply overcome by swarms of troops at relatively weak or low places. And it's the invention of cannon and the innovations in cannon and artillery design that proved to be the final elimination of walls as effective defensive bulwarks. For instance, the walls that had protected Constantinople, in the capital of the Byzantine Roman Empire, for 1,000 years were huge fortifications, much taller and wider than the Chinese walls or any others before them. But when the Ottoman Turks used modern cannons to attack those very Roman fortifications in 1453, they were broken and overcome. All this while, I've been talking about walls as mostly military protection, and I've been emphasizing that they've never been a permanent or even a very long-lasting protection against attack. But what about migration? What about trade? What about immigration? For the most part, ancient, medieval, and early modern civilizations didn't build walls to protect, I'm putting protect in quote marks, against these kinds of things. And all the evidence indicates that there were two reasons behind this. The first was a fact well known to political leaders. Walls alone don't keep out people who are determined to get in. People tunneled under the walls around ancient Sumer or walked around them in order to migrate, in order to work, in order to trade. And every other walled area we've talked about so far has been the same. In fact, most of the extensive walls, like Hadrian's Wall and the Great Wall of China, were also used to organize and regulate trade between those empires that they protected and native populations whose resources they needed. Walls may have kept armies out for a period of time, but it's pretty clear they weren't even intended to keep immigrants out. This was not only because imperial rulers knew that it would have been impossible to stop migration, but also that they didn't want to, for trade reasons, for reasons of keeping the peace. Finally, there are other walls built within the living memory of some of you Buzzkillers out there. The most recent one is the Israeli West Bank Wall, started in the mid-1990s, built to stop or reduce the effectiveness of terrorist attacks and car bombings. This West Bank Wall, and I'm putting wall in quotation marks for a reason here, it's because it's a relatively complex and lengthy series of different types of barriers, including fences. Now, these terrorist attacks have indeed declined dramatically since it was built. But the wall has also divided a country against itself. It's cloistered Jerusalem, for instance, and it's enhanced tensions by implying that Palestinian areas are inherently hostile and are a dangerous threat. And even though they have indeed cut off many Palestinians from some economic opportunities, the flow of Palestinian daily workers in and out of Jerusalem continues, even under these controlled circumstances. And there is perhaps no better example of the impermanence and ultimate ineffectiveness of walls than the one in Berlin. In the 60s and 70s, it seemed, among other things, to symbolize the Cold War and all its complications and all its tensions. Unlike the walls we've talked about so far, the Berlin Wall was designed not to keep people out, but to keep people in East Berlin. The government of East Germany claimed that they needed to wall off East Berlin to keep out Westerners and other enemies, but the real purpose was to prevent East Berliners from escaping East Berlin and Germany by going to West Berlin. And not only did it fail to do that completely, hundreds of people were able to subvert the wall, especially in the early years. The Berlin Wall projected a terrible image of the Soviet bloc trying to keep a population captive. Western politicians, especially JFK and Western media, played the comparisons with Western freedom to the hilt. Here, for instance, is JFK during his famous 1963 Ich bin ein Berliner speech, given, of course, within sight of the wall.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
Now, in addition to the president making propaganda hay out of something as stark and divisive as the Berlin Wall, newsreels, which were common back in those days, they celebrated escape attempts. And I have an example here, and it claimed that Khrushchev's face was slapped again every time there was a successful escape through the Berlin Wall.
The East Germans don't seem to have guards enough to plug every hole. When a soldier's attention is diverted by others, a hole is cut in the barbed wire and Khrushchev's face is slapped again.
Well, what does all this mean? What myths am I trying to bust, correct, or contextualize? The first is that border walls in history have been built not for migration or immigration prevention, but overwhelmingly for military and security reasons. And the second is that, for all kinds of other complicated reasons, military and technological innovation of attackers, empires and powerful states, eventually weakening from within, from behind their walls, if you will, and on and on and on. Physical bricks and mortar border walls have never been a permanent or even a very long-lasting protection against eventual invasion by, determined enemies. Anyone genuinely paying attention to immigration and even drug smuggling problems in the U.S. knows that the main problem is with people overstaying their tourist visas and becoming illegal in that way. And how did those overstaying tourists get here? They flew in ordinary jets on regularly scheduled, perfectly legit commercial flights. They flew over any walls that might have been built to keep them out. As a country, we need to solve the problems we have at the point where they prove to be problems. In this case, that's not at our southern border. And we need to call out simple-minded and ahistorical rhetoric designed to whip up nativist and anti-foreign emotions. It's demagoguery. And as a people, we should be better than that. Talk to you next week.